So, does Donald Trump have both Iran and Europe over a barrel? By walking away from the 2015 pact to curb Tehran's atomic ambitions, does it mean that Iran will now ratchet up its militarization? Already, hardliners opposed to current President Hassan Rouhani are cheering the United States, reimposing sanctions that state that any person or company that does any kind of transaction with Iran using a U.S. dollar, it falls under their remit. How can Europe's signatories stay in the deal? How should they respond? Will Trump's move on Iran stoke brewing trade battles and perhaps fundamentally alter transatlantic relations? And is this a personal defeat for France's President Emmanuel Macron, who worked so hard to convince Trump to stay in? Today in the France 24 debate, is it a dead deal? Talking about it with us from Washington, he worked on the Iran deal before and after it was concluded, first at the White House, then for Barack Obama's defense secretary. Nitin Chadha, founding partner at WestX Advisors. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Former French ambassador to the European Union, Pierre Vimont, is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Europe think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And just in from Riyadh, Salman Al-Ansari, who's the president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Francois.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The negotiations started way back in the 1990s. They culminated with those 20 months of hard bargaining back in 2015. The 5 permanent members of the European UN Security Council, Germany and the European Union, signing on to what's called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the GCPOA. Now, though, with one stroke of the pen,
as we exit the Iran deal, we will be working with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. This will include efforts to eliminate the threat of Iran's ballistic missile program, to stop its terrorist activities worldwide, and to block its menacing activity across the Middle East. In the meantime, powerful sanctions will go into full effect. If the regime continues its nuclear aspirations, it will have bigger problems than it has ever had before.
Bigger problems than it's ever had before. Nitin Chadha, how do you interpret that?
You know, I think it's a lot of tough talk without a lot of bite, because I think what we have effectively done is play our trump card, to use a pun, in that, you know, the strength of any approach that we take vis-a-vis Iran, as it relates to this nuclear accord and even more generally, is rooted in the ability to preserve and maintain an international consensus. And what we've done, and what this administration here has decided to do, is effectively walk away from that international consensus and at least chip away at a significant portion of it. And naturally, we were a leading voice in the buildup and the efforts and the diplomacy surrounding our efforts to achieve the conclusion of the JCPOA. But throughout the entire efforts to get to the point of developing a framework, we put in place a series of sanctions which, again, only had real effect, real bite, real impact on the Iranian economy and thus its decision-making by the virtue of keeping our partners and allies on board with us. And we have stepped away from that. So this is a significant blow to the international integrity that is essential for the viability of this deal going forward.
And why do you think Donald Trump did it?
You know, it's hard to get into the mind of the man, but you know what I can say is just from here, clearly there was a huge domestic political component to this. It was a campaign promise made from early days where he's been calling the deal terrible and worse, and he wanted to check that box, and this provided the first opportunity, frankly, to do so. But even more broadly, I think there's a framework in which he thinks. And I'll call it a framework, which is a generous term, but there's an approach that he likes to take in which he believes he can always get a better deal. But oftentimes not guided necessarily by fact or by the principled international approach that we've taken in this context, lacking also the nuance. And here we find ourselves with the belief, at least maybe by at least the president, that he can get a better deal with Iran by the virtue of playing hardball. But again, the hardball here is not our hardball to play. It's a hardball that we can play only because we've got on our team our international partners, including but not limited to the Europeans.
Pierre Vimont, how do you interpret this? What does this say what's transpired here after we followed these painstaking marathon talks for 20 months. They come up with this agreement where there's the Iran nuclear watch, the UN nuclear watchdog, which goes in and what do you make of the fact that Donald Trump has walked away?
First of all, you don't only talk about the last 20 months. The whole thing started in 2003, so it was the last 12 years of painful negotiation to try to reach that agreement. I don't know what to make out of this, only to say that this seems to be a trend in this Trump administration to go back on many of the multilateral agreements that have been reached so far. Climate change, the Paris Agreement, the trade agreements with the Pacific countries, so on and so forth, the decision to transfer the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. So I think there is a trend there, no doubt about it, that Trump is trying to play his own game, which makes it very difficult for the European partners.
Is it dangerous what he's doing?
It could be dangerous because you are facing a transatlantic partnership where the natural leader, the United States, is playing on its own. And for the other partners of that alliance, it makes life much more difficult for the future. How do you deal with a leadership that has totally changed its rules?
Salman al-Ansari, so with the United States walking away, is the deal dead, first of all?
I think the deal is dead. And it's on the way, actually, to be completely dead.
Is that good news?
To me, I think, okay, I used to be a big supporter of the nuclear deal. Anything that would stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb is a positive thing. But what was the previous administration hoping for? They were hoping that the moment they get Iran to be part of a deal, that they will get more moderate, that they will not interfere in the affairs of others, that they will be investing the money that they will take in their own people. But instead, what we have noticed that is completely the opposite. Iran started to expand more and more. They are supporting 75 militia just in Iraq. They are supporting militias and sending troops to Syria. They are supporting Hezbollah, which is somehow internationally recognized terrorist group. They are supporting Houthis, who are actually firing ballistic missiles. So imagine a country like Iran is sending the technology of ballistic missiles to a non-state actor. What does that mean to the security of the region? So we should not look at it from an economic point of view. We should look at it from purely security point of view, so we can get to a solution with this regime. And I see that there are people who are supportive of the nuclear deal and took it to a new level of seeing the nuclear deal as a religion. It's not. It's been there for 3 years, like since the time it got signed. And let's ask the question, the simple question. What if Trump managed with his allies to get a better deal? Wouldn't everyone be happy? We would be happy. But the issue is that the people are having this kind of pessimistic view of Iran to be going through a different set of negotiation. But let's actually be optimistic. Why? Because Iran right now is in its weakest point ever internally, domestically in Iran. The rial, which is the currency of Iran, is 60,000 is equal to $1. So the economy is crippled, even though the nuclear deal has been signed and everything, and the unrest within the Iranian regions and everything. So the international community have a lot to do to get Iran on track. We should not miss the opportunity, because the deal does not stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon, but it only delays it or postpones it until 2025, which is 7 years from now. 7 years is nothing.
All right, the issue of the sunset clause, issues, of course, that don't pertain to the deal, such as the development of ballistic missiles. One point in what you said, I want to get Nitin Chadha's reaction to it. The fact that in the 3 years since the Iran nuclear deal, we've seen the Iranian military flex its muscle in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere. Has Iran been emboldened since the deal?
In short order, no. To the contrary, look, the same hardline elements that were undertaking those activities inside and outside of Iran and exporting instability in the region remain the same. Of course, the cadence, the pace, the frequency may have modulated over time, but if you look at over a longer period of time, including the time of the 8 years of the Obama administration and before, there were times at which the Iranian military similarly flexed this muscle. They harassed certainly U.S. vessels in the Straits of Hormuz and elsewhere in the region. They would engage in, and no question, support for proxy groups in Syria and elsewhere, much like my colleague cited. But one point I want to address that he mentioned where I profoundly disagree. There was certainly no hope or expectation that by the virtue of getting in place the JCPOA, that Iran would moderate itself. Actually, quite the contrary. We sought to conclude the JCPOA with the explicit recognition that Iran was not getting any more moderate anytime soon. And the number one priority for the international community should be is to shackle their nuclear program in a way that definitively addressed their ability to acquire a nuclear weapon.
And which way Iran goes now is another big question. France's president, speaking on the phone earlier with his Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani, both pledging to try to keep the agreement on track. But Iran's supreme leader says he doesn't trust the European signatories to the deal.
Now it is being said that we can continue the nuclear deal with these three European countries, Britain, France, and Germany. I don't trust these three countries. If you cannot get a strong guarantee from the European signatories of a nuclear deal, and I believe it's very unlikely that you can, we cannot continue like this anymore.
On that point, Salman al-Ansari, the conservatives, the hardliners, they're with Trump on this one, it sounds like. We had on Monday in Kayan, which is a newspaper directly overseen by the Supreme Leader, an editorial describing the deal as a stinking corpse. We've had remarks from the head of the powerful Revolutionary Guards in Iran, who is saying the fate of the Iran deal is clear. Is this good news, the fact that the hardliners are cheering for the end to the deal?
Yeah, let's actually have it very clear. The one who calls the shot in Iran is the Supreme Leader and let's say the far-right extremist, whatever. I do not believe that there is a moderate group within the political fabric of Iran because they are all should be subjected to the Supreme
Hassan
Leader.
Rouhani's predecessor was more hardline than him. Will this not embolden the hardliners domestically inside Iran?
For us, we need to identify what is a hardline. Being a hardliner means having a crazy rhetoric or having crazy actions. I see Iran to have consistently been having crazy actions. So rhetoric is, regardless of rhetoric of Nejad, regardless of rhetoric of Zarif, who smiles everywhere in Europe, the actions speak louder than words. And we saw, look, what is happening right now, what we can see on TV right now, they are burning the American flag, and Death to America is the main slogan. People who want to get Iran to be globalized or part of the community, they always want to show that it's a right and left struggle within Iran. No, it's a struggle within the system of the core of the system itself. And if you want to tell me that Rouhani and Zarif are more moderate than the others, I actually don't buy it because I don't see any action that support that either in the region or domestically as well.
Pierre Vimont.
Francois, could I chime in here for a minute?
Could I just come in here for a
First,
second?
Pierre Vimont.
The point, I think, I don't want to get into the question and the argument about is there a hard line or moderates. I think there are, but to some extent it doesn't matter because the real issue now is about the logic of what was built with the JCPOA and the deal that was done at the time. It was a two-dimension agreement where on one side Iran was agreeing to suspend its nuclear program, but on the other side it would get the benefit of economic investment. And now the Europeans are caught in this impossible situation where they still have to try to keep Iran with the suspension, with the freeze of the nuclear agreement, while it's going to be very difficult for them to keep on selling them the idea that there is going to be economic development because of the US sanctions. For Europeans, it's going to be much more difficult to go on trading and investing in Iran. And because of this unbalance now at the moment with this deal, how can you on earth sell to the Iranian, be the moderate one, be a moderate or a hardliner, that you should stick to this agreement and go ahead with it when you can't deliver what was promised. This is really the political issue that is there at the moment for Europeans and for all those. We tend to forget also about Russia and China. How do you sell to the Iranians the idea that they should stick to this and go ahead with this? Because there, I totally agree with our friend in Washington. What's the purpose of having built and negotiated this agreement, which at least allowed for some stability on the whole issue of proliferation of nuclear weapons?
Mr. Ambassador, there is a proverb in Arabic that says, يدي في الماء وغيري في النار, أو يدي في النار وغيري في الماء. It means my hand is in fire, and I mean by my hand as the people in the GCC, in the Middle East, and the people in Europe have their hand in normal water. So why I'm saying this? Because we are actually affected heavily by the Iran regime. When you have, just imagine a country that is by the borders or close to the borders of France that keeps sending ballistic missile technology and militant groups to attack Paris in almost a weekly basis. Do you, as Paris, will accept that us as Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Kuwait would go and deal with that country and support its economic empowerment?
But
not at all. So it's a principle.
Yeah.
We should forget about economy for a second. Guys, I know that there are Airbus deals that equals to $10 billion with, and you don't want to risk it here in France. I know that there were 160,000 cars by Renault have been sold last year. But let's pause for a second and
to say about
think
this
about
point.
it
And this is
from a political and security. Yeah.
This is the heart of the matter for Europe. Unfortunately, we've taken a very quick break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the day after Donald Trump announced that the United States in the coming days will be walking away from the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. We're talking in the company of a man who worked on the Iran deal before and after it was concluded, first at the White House, then for Barack Obama's defense secretary. Nitin Chadha, founding partner at WestX Advisors, is with us from Washington. And here in the studio, former French ambassador to the European Union, Pierre Vimont, today senior fellow at the Carnegie Europe think tank, and Salman Al-Ansari, president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. Welcome back to all of you. We have been getting reactions from European leaders about how to make this deal continue to work here in Paris with the French president, who's been speaking on the telephone to his Iranian counterpart. But we're also hearing the same kind of message out of London and out of Berlin.
Can the Prime Minister tell us, in her representations to the President on Saturday, did she speak in the strongest terms on the lunacy of the actions that the President of the United States is taking?
Prime Minister.
I have been very clear in a number of conversations with the President of the United States about the belief of the United Kingdom that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, should stay.
We have noted with regret but also concern this withdrawal by the United States, which is of course serious for such an agreement. We will remain committed to the agreement and will do everything in our power to ensure that Iran also meets its obligations in the future.
In Zukunft seine Verpflichtungen einhält.
And I believe yesterday showed us once again that we will face more responsibility in Europe, in foreign policy, in the area of securing peace, and in the area of the political solutions we must find.
We will face more responsibility in Europe. Emmanuel Macron going one further, Ambassador Vimont, saying Europe must save multilateralism.
Yes, he's to some extent he's right, because if there is one common feature to all the decisions taken by the current US administration, seems to be something that is moving away from multilateralism. The problem is really, in my opinion, because I tend to agree with the idea that the JCPOA to some extent has been given a deadly blow. It's how through multilateralism invent something new. And along the lines, I guess, of what President Macron has explained and mentioned while he was in Washington, which is to look again at the whole regional security in the regions, taking up some of the points made by in this debate a few minutes ago about the Iranian interference in the different countries, its ballistic missile program, so on and so forth. But in order to do that, you need some sort of stability, you need a dialogue that can go on. And this is very difficult to do while you have the pressure of sanctions and economic sanction and the clear...
On that point, the French have been already anticipating, since last fall, the Public Investment Bank here has been trying to set up a little fund that doesn't use US dollars. Can that work?
Of course you can try things like that, but it's nothing of the magnitude of the kind of business you want to have with Iran. You know, if you only look at the Airbus deal, it was something like $40 billion that are at stake. And of course...
Yeah, and Airbus, the problem there is you've got spare parts that come from the United States.
Absolutely. And by the way, it's the same for Boeing, which was also about to sell some aircraft to Iran, and they are facing exactly the same problem now. So with US sanction, in spite of what everything is being said at the moment, it's going to be very difficult to find ways of overcoming this strong opposition from the United States.
Now, another option, Nitin Chadha, is, and this was floated by a spokesperson for the French government earlier, is taking the United States to the World Trade Organization if they interfere with business deals. Can that work?
I mean, again, it speaks to the question of intent. What are we trying to achieve here? If the goal is to preserve and maintain the integrity of the JCPOA and keep Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, the survivability of that deal resides within leverage. Leverage that is fundamentally related to the amount of economic pressure we as an international community can put upon Iran or take away and take off of Iran. Our walking away from this leaves the Europeans, even despite their commitment and their intent to want to stay in this deal, with less leverage, and thus the ability to get the Iranians to stay in the deal as it stands, let alone negotiate even better terms, is a near improbable scenario. And the notion that somehow, you know, the Europeans or others may cite issues with how we approach the sanctions regime and try to deliver it in international bodies is a very drawn-out process.
Just to remind our viewers, Nitin, a few years back, we had a hefty fine slapped on French bank BNP for a deal that was done with Iran, and because it had involved U.S. dollars.
Absolutely. Look, money is a coward. Money is a coward, and even if not a sanction put in place, but the threat of sanctions has a significant chilling effect in the movement of commerce. And ultimately, our ability to influence Iranian behavior on the nuclear file. And oh, by the way, I agree with my colleague Salman and the ambassador that Iran is doing a whole bunch of very concerning stuff, if you will, in the region, both for its export of instability, but also on the ballistic missile dimension, which is a separate topic, and we should talk about it. But fundamentally, keeping this regime away from a nuclear weapon is part and parcel, has to do with our ability to preserve this deal. And the European framework that you know they have left to try to piece together to preserve the deal is one that's not guided by any clear strategy, because they don't have, again, the clear amount of leverage required to keep the Iranians in the deal. And the Iranians have now asserted the higher ground with the hardliners empowered. So this is really the worst of all worlds. It's the least desirable outcome, if you will, on a 2x2 matrix. And here's the challenge we find ourselves in.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, some of them not very clement to Donald Trump. One here, let's hope the EU has the balls, excuse the expression, to stand up against certain U.S. blackmail over trade if Europe continues to do business with Iran. High time the U.S. understood they're not the world economic power they once were. Put Trump in his place. Garbage can of history. That's on the hashtag F24 debate. But again, Emmanuel Macron trying to save more than the deal, Nitin. He wants to save multilateralism. Is that possible? Yeah. Can Europe do it? Or is, once again, Europe going to, as one editorial put it this Wednesday morning, do what they always do in this case when they have a confrontation with the United States? Nothing.
Look, I am a profound believer in the multilateral approach when and where possible. That being said, and while I appreciate President Macron's intent and he's guided by his principle, ultimately, the ability to do so in this context is extremely limited. And even beyond the Iran deal, multilateralism, again, resides in a clear framework in which all countries are steering towards a shared and common objective. And here we're not necessarily doing that. We're inherently fractured. So just by natural extension of that logic, there's no universe in which a single state can preserve multilateralism if the United States is not willing to be a part of that enterprise. And that's, again, that's one of the principal challenges. But even more broadly, to speak to intent, if the goal of any president, including the French president, is to work collaboratively with shared powers in achieving an end state that makes the world safer than not safer, then right now the effort should be placed 100% in trying to come up with a framework for either preserving the deal or addressing the key elements that the current UN administration finds most offensive, to try to bring the Iranians back to the conversation so we can have a structured approach to go forward and address those outstanding concerns. Otherwise, this falls apart on its head, and it's extremely difficult to do yet again. Again, if past is prologue, and I think the ambassador made reference to it before, but there have been deals with the Iranians on the nuclear file with just the Europeans or some combination of European countries, and they've all fallen through over time. And what was fundamentally different of the JCPOA, and why, by the way, it has worked thus far with 10 IEA reports asserting Iranian compliance, is because of the U.S. role, but also the clear framework in which all countries were in agreement on the measure of transparency and the measure of leverage we were putting on the table to achieve that transparency.
So, what kind of world are we heading towards if multilateral deals, multilateral organizations matter less?
Look, I mean, we're heading more towards chaos and entropy than we are, a consolidated international framework that's guided by principle, and it's going to take leadership, ideally by the United States and others, to be able to deal with issues like, to the points that Salman was making, dealing with the crisis in Syria, dealing with the continued proxy wars in Yemen and elsewhere, dealing with instability in Iraq. I mean, all of these problems have festered in large part because there's been no unified international approach. So the notion that the world is going to be more fragmented and somehow more safe is I think, a fundamentally flawed way of looking at things.
Salman Al-Ansari?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with Nathan about these ideas. But just to mention something about the tweet that you've read, or the comment, because I feel that there is this kind of widespread feelings of French and Germans and British that they should not be following the US. Let's have it in this way. Let's imagine after Russia took Crimea, that the US would come up and say, I'm not going to sanction Russia. Would the French and British and Germans be happy about that? And they would be like, yeah, it's multilateralism and the US should do whatever they want. This is the thing. It's a principle. Forget about economy. That's what I keep saying. When it comes to Iran, forget about economy, forget about opportunities. Think about the principle of security, of global interest when it comes to security. That's very important to mention. The second thing is, if you go and check the national security strategy that has been published 4 months ago by the White House, they said it very clearly: achieving peace through strength. Is that something going to work? I believe so. Why? Because if you talk and deal with such regimes like the Iranian regime and its militias around the world, you cannot deal with diplomacy. So that's why we see.
But do you agree with Ambassador Vimont when he says the world might be a more dangerous place after the tearing up of this deal?
Okay, it's a one decision that we have to take. Either we take it now or delay it for the days after, and to throw the dirt under the carpet. We don't want that. We don't want to get to that position in 7 years after Iran acquires more power, after Iran gets to be more expansionist. So that's the thing. Let's deal with it now. Better now than later.
Leaving aside for a moment the Middle East or even security issues and looking at the multilateral system as it is, what we are witnessing at the moment, and there I would be more cautious than our friend in Washington, is precisely that multilateral system is moving ahead without the Americans on some issues. Look at the agreement, the TPP, the trade agreement with the Pacific countries. Trump decided to stay out, and the other members are moving ahead anyway. Look at the Paris Agreement on climate change. Trump decides to leave, but the other partners say we go ahead anyway. So I don't mean this works in every circumstances, but there is something moving which shows, even in WTO business, that the partners of America are well decided, have decided that they would move ahead anyway. And maybe at the end of the day, with regard to the Iranian nuclear deal, and I agree that JCPOA has a deadly blow, but something different may slowly come out. After all, maybe we are in this typical case, as we have seen with North Korea, of a division of labor between the good cop and the bad cop. And the good cops being here the Europeans, plus maybe Russia and China, who can come out with something new as they move along. It will take time. On this, I'm quite sure. And this is maybe going to be the most difficult problem for all of us. We have on one side a US administration that is going to put more and more pressure and not leave us much time to try to work out something significant and useful. But we can work on this because this is going to be more and more, as we move ahead, the issue we have to face and the challenge we have to face. Can we go ahead with multilateralism without America? I think we can, but we have to find ways of doing that, and we have to invent it.
And Nitin Chadha, on that point, this is not something that started with Donald Trump. We remember speeches by Barack Obama, first of all saying, you know, the U.S. couldn't play cop everywhere. We had a speech once, the then French foreign minister going to the United States, urging the Americans, this was under Obama, to stay engaged in a multilateral world. What's going on in the United States?
No, look, again, this speaks to some of the points I made earlier regarding a domestic political class that has emerged here, that's certainly one of the core base of support for Donald Trump and the administration, that, you know, expects a world in which the American kind of goes it on its own. And the tough-talking unilateralism that we've heard here in the States sometimes leads you to a misguided outcome. And,
but the rejection of interventionism, that's also something that's shared with many Democrats.
No question, right? So this is the duality of the rhetoric of the Trump administration. It is a regime that touts non-interventionism, but at the same time wants an approach that's guided by strength. Well, which one is it? Are you going to intervene aggressively, even if not militarily, to achieve your outcomes, or are you going to take a passive approach in which you withdraw from the international stage and let other powers, be what they may, with their objectives, be what they may, determine the course of the future? And to the ambassador's point, which I agree with to an extent, multilateralism can work without the United States, but the question is, what is the quality of the outcome? I mean, sure, TPP, which we've now walked away from, there are a number of regional and sub-regional conversations ongoing, but many of the rules of the road for trade in Asia could potentially be shaped by China, which TPP specifically sought to not allow happen. So the question is, again, are we allowing ourselves to get to a suboptimal outcome with a degraded sense of multilateralism? And while appreciating that other world powers will try to step up and do more together, we're also allowing the stage to be much more freely taken by actors such as Russia, whose quite literal approach is to play the spoiler role. They oftentimes don't have an affirmative agenda on their own, but the Putin regime seeks to frustrate the objectives of the global community. And without a strong and unified multilateral front that includes the United States, but is not only the United States, that is sometimes the best way to confront those bad or unhelpful actors, be it in the Iran context or in the Russia context.
And it brings us to what we're seeing developing in the Middle East, which is, on the one hand, the Saudis close to the Israelis when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Iran, and on the other hand, the other countries there. And there seems to be, again, this growing divide there. By the way, a London-based monitoring group reports an Israeli attack that happened just after there was that speech by Donald Trump late on Tuesday. Iranian military facilities hit south of Damascus, at least 15 killed, including 8 Iranians. This was in Kisweh, and it follows last month's airstrike on a T-4 airbase near Homs that killed 7 Iranians. We're also seeing, on the one hand, the Israelis hitting those positions. On the other hand, Hezbollah allies making gains in legislative elections in Lebanon, and all around it feels, if you look at this week on Salman al-Ansari, that tensions are rising in the Middle East, not receding.
And that's what I'm actually talking about. If we let the Iran regime keep receiving money, receiving global money out of the deal, they will keep continuing doing the same thing, where they expand more and more. And after 7 years, we will have less options than we do right now. So that's the core of the principle that I'm talking about.
Well, I disagree with that point.
Security.
I have to disagree with that point, Salman.
Sure, go ahead.
I have to disagree on that one narrow point. No, just to say, sorry to interrupt you, Salman. Apologies.
No problem.
I don't think this reduces our options. To the contrary, I mean, the JCPOA, the way it's structured, fully recognizing it was not a permanent or forever deal, it put significant constraints and unprecedented levels of transparency while preserving all of the same options that we as the international community had before the deal, after the deal. In fact, it strengthened our hand because it will be done so with the level of credibility and the legitimacy, having attempted and succeeded with a diplomatic outcome. So when the time came, 5, 6, 7 years from the date at which the JCPOA went in effect, to negotiate a second part of the agreement, which is always envisioned, again, to be a multi-part agreement, not a forever agreement.
I actually agree.
Do so, again, with years of compliance.
I agree with the fact that we are right now in a good position because we know all the infrastructure of the nuclear planets, etc., in Iran. But if we keep leaving the other big issue of the Iran regime, the philosophy of its regime, the expansionist regime, and keep it aside and just say, okay, the nuclear deal is separate from the behaviors of Iran, and let's deal with the behavior of Iran alone without going after the money that they will take and fund and tunnel and channel it through the militant group in the region, that's very risky. So
you're arguing that we should put it all in one thing.
Exactly.
One final question for you, Pierre Vimont. Is France's president weakened by all of this? Emmanuel Macron, he's just been for that state visit to Washington. He made this heavy pitch earlier. Our Tehran correspondent saying Iranians are disappointed that the Europeans got nothing out of Donald Trump.
I'm not sure anybody was expecting really a big change in the U.S. president's attitude. I don't think Macron is weakened because I think nobody will blame him for having tried to get something out of the American president. But he is certainly in a very difficult position now.
He comes across as weak by not getting it.
No, I don't think he will come as weak, because he will come as a responsible person, just like Angela Merkel and Theresa May, who were right in trying to keep what we have at the moment without breaking it. I think this is well understood by public opinion in Europe. We may agree, and I can agree with a lot of what should be added to that, but you know, the one person who, in my opinion, always gave the right definition of what JCPOA was Cathy Ashton, who used to say this is only a first stage, of more and more must be done afterwards. And this was very well understood, at least certainly in this country, in France.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because we're out of time. I want to thank you, Pierre Vimont. I want to thank Nitin Chadha for being with us from Washington. Salman Al-Ansari, stay with us. Media Watch is next.